Hello, we're making meaning, telling our stories with the conviction that you're a story too.
My name's Andy Griffiths,
And my name's Imogen.
and this is the sixth in a series of conversations about making meaning. We're hoping to tell the story of lockdown and emergence, or whatever we're calling it now, in ways that help other people tell their stories too. And we're really excited to be joined today by Dr. Isabelle Hamley.
Yes, it's great to welcome you, Isabelle. And you're currently writing a commentary on the Book of Judges, I believe,
Yes.
and you're chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yes, that is what I'm doing at the moment. Been working as chaplain for a few years now, and it's quite fun and very busy with lots of traveling, which all suddenly stopped with lockdown, which was quite a change.
Yeah.
Isabelle, we're really grateful that you've joined us. So, how do you tell the story of lockdown?
Well, my story of lockdown might be slightly different from others in that I got COVID the week before lockdown started. And I then was ill throughout the whole of lockdown. So I've got what's called long COVID. You might hear my voice gets quite hoarse still. So 7 months on, I still haven't had one day without a cough. So for me, COVID is actually quite a practical reality. I've been to hospital a few times. I didn't need to be admitted, but I have had pneumonia and lots of impact on my lungs and my health overall of COVID, with a lot of time off work. So for the best part of lockdown, actually, I was just in bed and getting very, very bored with daytime TV. Yeah, so there's only so many times you can watch Homes Under the Hammer. It's been a really interesting time, because normally I would have been at work with the Archbishop's team, part of trying to work out how do we respond as a church, how do we support local parishes, how do we support people wherever they are so that they can think about what's going on, so that they can feel supported. I have a particular brief on mental health, so I would have done some of that work. And instead, everything stopped. And I have to live through COVID from the inside almost, rather than looking at it as something outside of me, which I might have to try not to catch. And that made me kind of think quite a lot about what it means to be human, actually, and to be small and limited and powerless and actually not in control of our fate by and large, that everything happening around me I had very little control of. I mean, I could barely even walk from my bedroom to the bathroom. I was utterly dependent on everyone around me. And as my illness has got a bit better, but still carried on being quite debilitating. And we're moving to this kind of time of year, and I'm thinking about Christmas. I think this is really making me think quite a lot about the incarnation and the absolutely enormous risk that God took within it. That sense of, gosh, becoming human is a pretty big risk. It's a pretty big thing. And if God was willing to take that risk, what do I do with it? Because I guess often we try to move away from risk, don't we? That we live in a society that wants to be risk-free, that, where we want to try and have the best medical care we possibly can for everything, where we think doctors should be able to cure us. And actually, for me, lockdown and battling with COVID has been battling with the complete unknown. Actually, nobody knows whether my lungs will recover. It's a new illness. Nobody knows anything. Nobody can tell me how long I'm likely to carry on coughing. So there's a huge unknown, which I think people for most of history would have been very familiar with, but in the world today, particularly in England and in Western nations, we're not very used to. And that's made me kind of wonder, how do we live well in a way that's not shaped, in a way that's responsible and yet not shaped by trying to avoid the reality of our humanity. That makes sense too.
It makes enormous sense, yes. And you've gone to the incarnation to think about vulnerability, and I wonder if there's any other sort of passages from the Bible or figures from the Bible that you really sort of journeyed with over the last 6 months.
Well, I'm not sure. It's not really a story. It's more of a couple of verses that I have lived with for most of my life, but have been particularly significant for these last few months, which is Romans 8:38-39, which tells us that nothing can separate us from the love of God that we have seen in Jesus. And I had this kind of almost epiphany moment where it was on Easter, and Easter in lockdown was just strange, wasn't it? I couldn't even watch an online service. I was just so tired. All I could do was lie in bed. I couldn't even pray because I was too tired. And I had a holding cross, and I didn't even have the strength to particularly hold on to the holding cross. And suddenly this passage kind of came to me with that sense that it's okay for me not to be able to hold on, because actually God holds on to me, and he's the one who holds on, and nothing can separate me from the love of God. And I've journeyed with that and kind of reflected on what that means, not just in this situation, but more widely, that sense that we often, or perception is often, that circumstances separate us from God, all these big things. Why does God allow it? Why is it? Where is God? But within all of that, God is holding on to us, even when we can't see it.
Isabelle, in our past conversations, we've been thinking about how we frame our individual stories or our local stories. But in your role as Archbishop's chaplain, I guess you might have a sense of how the church is telling a story nationally or even internationally about COVID. What sort of shape is emerging for the church's story, would you think?
I think there's good and bad, probably, just as always. The thing that strikes me as I read, what friends are doing, as I hear stories of what people are doing, is almost a rediscovery of church as community. This sense that when you can't meet physically in a building, where you can't touch, when you can't do some of the things we're used to doing, what we're reduced to is that link with one another. That sense that we belong together. So how do we live that belonging in a time when we can't do that through what we normally do? And I hope that that's going to be something really fruitful for the church as we go back into our buildings and go back to do the things that nurture our life together, that are really important. But I think the key for the church will be to ask itself, how do we build on what we've learned and integrate it, and let it be the heartbeat of our life together? So, and often it's very small stories, isn't it? Or stories that don't get told, of people doing somebody else's shopping, of churches carrying on and increasing their food banks suddenly, or meals for the homeless during the pandemic and lockdown. It's that service of the community, but also trying to work out, how do you tell the story of faith in a new age, and in a new life, and in a much more prosaic way. I think the church learning to go digital is no bad thing, because there were pockets of people doing it, but suddenly I think a lot of what was old has been propelled into the new. And again, we're in the middle of trying to work it out, and the question of, how do we hold our tradition or life together and everything that's precious, and yet enable it to speak in a new way. I think it's the question that's faced the church all the time, throughout the centuries, but it's been sharpened all of a sudden. It's forced us to try and tell the story again. And in many places it's working. Again, it's encouraging to see that there are many places where more people than normal have joined in online services. And equally, a lot of people have looked for local online services, which I think is fascinating, because it's saying that actually there is something about locality, about the possibility of being a real physical community that still matters. We're not just a digital world full of disembodied networks. Actually, we are human beings, we have bodies, and our belonging to place and time makes a difference. And again, so what does the church do with that? How do we creatively look at the parish system, so that we honor that sense of belonging to place and yet let it flow into the newness of what we learned?
Isabelle, thank you so much for joining us. Andy and I are going to keep on having conversations like this, and you can find the whole project at meaningmaking.card.co, and card is spelt CARRD.
And Imogen and I will be back with another conversation, but what counts is your story. Thank you for listening.